distinguished speakers and guests, I'm delighted to play a moderating role for the first session of today's program. The theme of the session 1 is the current state of the North Korean economy. It's my great pleasure to introduce you the three contributors to this session. The first speaker, William Brown, an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, was unfortunately not able to attend today due to a medical problem. However, he submitted his presentation and paper titled North Korea and Its Money. I appreciate Dr. Bill Brown for committing to this event. On behalf of Bill Brown, Mr. William Newcomb will present his work and play a panelist role for this session. I sincerely appreciate Mr. Newcomb, for this replacement with such a short notice. Mr. Bill Newcomb chairs the North Korea Economic Forum at the Institute of Korean Studies, George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. He is a fellow at Center for Advanced Defense Studies and a member of the National Committee on North Korea. He was a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins SAIS and senior advisor at Global Threat Advisory Services. In 2011, Mr. Newcomb was appointed by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to serve on the panel of experts established pursuant to Resolution 1874 of the year 2009. Mr. Newcomb retired from the Treasury Department, where he was a senior economic advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis. He also served as Deputy Coordinator of North Korean Working Group and the Senior Economist of Asia, Bureau of Intelligence and Research Department of the State Department. He wrote extensively on developments in China, North Korea, and Vietnam for US policymakers. Okay, Jung-ho Kim, Dr. Jung-ho Kim is the second speaker of this session. He is going to talk about the demystifying the North Korean economy, implications for the future engagement. Dr. Jung-ho Kim is a visiting scholar at George Washington Institute for Korean Studies with the expertise on political, economic issues of North Korea and Northeast Asia. He worked as a senior research fellow at the Export-Import Bank of Korea, participating in numerous government projects and task forces regarding strategy for effective engagement with North Korean economy. Prior to the career at the Korean Exim Bank, he taught at University of Hawaii and Manoa. Lastly, Dr. Kevin Gray is a reader in international relations at University of Success School of Global Studies. Okay, he has researched widely on the political economy of both North and South Korea. His research has been published in many journals, including Review of International Political Economy, Journal of Contemporary Asia, Pacific Review, North Korean Review, and Globalization. His talk is about present and future trajectories of North Korean development in a comparative perspective. I guess we have 1 hour and 50 minutes for this session. So I'm going to ask each speaker to spend 20 to 25 minutes to present so that we can have a sufficient time to discuss with the floor guests.
I'm very sorry that Bill couldn't do this. This is a topic he's quite passionate about, and it's been developing for quite some time. I can't do it justice, but all I can do is read the paper, and hope you bear with me in the fact that I'm reading a paper rather than giving a presentation. The title of Bill's paper is North Korea and Its Money. And I don't know how many people realize how new that kind of statement is. Because when I first started studying North Korea back in the 1970s, money didn't matter. And of course, now it does, and that's the point of what Bill is writing about. I don't know how many of you noticed last month when Asia Press, out of Tokyo, in its usual biweekly report on prices in North Korea, suddenly upped the value of the US dollar to 9,400 North Korean won after years of having it sit tight right about 8,400 won, a roughly 10% devaluation of the won and about an 8% drop against the already weak RMB. I usually watch this rate through the excellent NK Daily site, but there the rate remained at about its old rate, no real change. I called around a bit to find out which was right, and people, including Daily NK, said the won had suddenly fallen for a short time and they were looking into it, but without satisfactory answers. To me, this was big news if accurate. A sudden 10% jerk downward from a pegged rate would, it seem, cause panic among anyone holding won, thinking that the government had lost control or had finally exhausted dollar reserves to support won. They would sell en masse, creating a self-sustaining downward spin that would send the dollar rate up to 10,000, 20,000 or more. Inflation would soar and people would be in the streets. It has happened before when money was much less important in North Korea, and it had big repercussions even then. I'm still not sure what happened, but such a panic did not erupt, and both Asia Press and Daily NK now report the won is back to about its 5-year, amazingly stable rate of a little over 8,000 won to the dollar. I've been calling the won a pegged currency, but now I'm much less sure what to think. Why does all this matter? We should look a little at history and theory. It's not all that complicated, and it tells nicely the dismal story of North Korea's economy and where it sits now, perhaps with a faint glimpse of the future. But it also shows the need for different kinds and more precise attention to information coming out of North Korea, and a bit of what I say is laziness on the part of North Korea watchers of all stripes. North Korea is changing, becoming more normal, and as in all normal countries, money and all prices that go with it matters, and not just for economics. The topic of this panel is change in North Korea, and I would say the biggest change I have seen since I first started looking at it in the mid-1970s is the use of money. In Kim Il-sung's old centrally planned economy, or using a better label, command economy, money in a classical definition, medium of exchange, a universal pricing mechanism, and most importantly, a store of value, did not exist. The state had taken ownership of the means of production, that is, capital of all kinds, and all land and other resources, and in a fixed price system, dictated or commanded the allocation of labor in all production. Distribution was by ration, not money. Ration cards may look a bit like money, but like airline miles, they should never be confused with such because they lack a store of value. Your ration ticket may have allowed you to some food for 10 days, but after that it was worthless, and it was non-transferable. No one could stockpile assets they could use to become capitalists. Karl Marx liked the system because it freed workers from some of the cutthroat competition of the Industrial Revolution. But Lenin and the Soviets, and Mao and Kim after him, loved it because it was an ideal way to control people. People without any money in their pockets were, and are, at the mercy of the party cadre who dole out rations. It's a long, well-worn story by now, but rationed or command economies make exceedingly inefficient use of scarce resources, and all have failed. Famines are the usual result, including North Korea. As they fail, money seeps in to replace the ration ticket. The ticket producers are corrupted. the state loses control over the economy and even its own workers. Meanwhile, the private assets allowed by money are used much more efficiently and the economy grows, but not in the way the socialist state can tolerate. Competition through markets, not command through rations, becomes the driver. In Russia and Eastern Europe, this change occurred rapidly. In China, slowly and methodically. But in North Korea, it has moved in fits and starts, with the ration system never, even now, completely gone. Unlike the communist giants, the North Korean government has always found ways to obtain just enough foreign aid to keep the ration system alive, either through extortion or beggary, but not enough to completely restore the command system. The way I picture it, Kim Il-sung's ration economy dissolved with the famine to a bad money economy under Kim Jong-il's leadership, with people forced to use highly inflation-prone North Korean won instead of rations, and then to the remarkably liberal, partially dollarized economy of Kim Jong-un. I'm not sure he had any choice, but the young leader did an amazing job of getting inflation under control by pegging the won to the dollar and getting citizens to freely accept US dollars, RMB, and North Korean won at stable rates. Now for 5 years or longer. 3 currencies now circulate freely in everyone's wallets, as freely as, say, in a currency board economy like Hong Kong. And this freedom to own wealth has sparked a huge increase in private-led productivity, which we see on the streets of Pyongyang and in some other cities. But there are 2 problems, 2 very big problems. Kim Jong-un's state allows the liberal use of money, but it still insists on state ownership of most of the means of production, including, most importantly, land. And agriculture, with 1/3 of the population, is still collectivized. Moreover, North Korean state workers, maybe 1/3 of the population, are still paid ration, not money wages. This creates a system with at least 2 prices for everything, a ration price and a market price, with the differences up to 100 times. 2 prices for the same thing spells incredible inefficiency, arbitrage, and corruption. In fact, as a result, I would say North Korea makes the least productive use of its not small stock of capital, including human capital, of any country in the world. A school teacher, probably a college graduate, in the state system earns 3,500 won per month, plus ever withering rations. Her high school sister in a semi-autonomous textile factory may earn 300,000 won a month without rations. Still only $1 or $2 a day, but enough to have a cell phone and an occasional cup of coffee. But without legal property rights and worries her dollars might be confiscated, she is unlikely to invest her earnings and thus spends all she earns, leading to what visitors see as conspicuous consumption amid incredible poverty. The second big problem is what we hear about, the trade sanctions. It is false to think of North Korea as a hermit kingdom. Since 1945, it's always depended a great deal on trade, and most of its industries have been built with aid from abroad. Important commodities, such as all of its petroleum, fuels, and plastics, and some of its food, is imported. But since China jumped on board the UN sanctions in 2017, after the big nuclear test, North Korean exports have fallen about 80% and imports by about 40%. A tiny uptick this year, exports and imports of watch parts, gets the news, but the real story is no one in the world will trade normally with Pyongyang except through expensive, illicit methods. So through August of this year, the country imported virtually no industrial equipment or vehicles, no mechanical parts, no metals, no chips. Necessary consumption goods imports, such as cereals and fertilizers, have continued, but almost nothing in the way of investment products was purchased for future growth. Meanwhile, Kim, instead of talking about prosperity, is talking about self-reliance, which, to any North Korean, must mean belt-tightening. Now, I believe we have the slide up that shows North Korea's trade through the first half of the year in successive years, 16, 17, 18, and 19. And if you look at the slide, you can see how the various trade elements of imports have fallen pretty drastically, particularly this past year. And then this is the corresponding North Korean exports, and you can see the exports have fallen even more dramatically, and of course the trade deficit in commodities has risen quite substantially since China did put the brakes on a lot of its trade. So this brings us back to the exchange rate and how Kim's been able to keep it stable, and more importantly, whether he will be able to keep the country's finance, money, and budgets under control. As best as I can estimate, based largely on Chinese customs data, North Korea's goods trade deficit with the world has increased to about $2 billion a year, from less than $1 billion a year prior to the Chinese actions in 2017, or about $150 million a month outflow. Certainly there is reason to believe there is also substantial unrecorded goods trade, both imports and exports, a likely services and remittances surplus, and perhaps a small amount of foreign investment inflows, Chinese Koreans buying cheap Korean apartments. This income may have offset the persistent goods trade deficit up through 2017, but it's difficult to see that in the face of sanctions on all kinds of services and overseas labor, that this income could have risen to offset the increased goods deficit. Moreover, people making exchange rate decisions inside North Korea would probably have no better insight than we do, and certainly would know of the near Chinese embargo on North Korean sales. So given a likely dollar or RMB outflow, why don't they sell their yuan and buy the ever-present dollars in RMB? It's a tricky question, but my hypothesis is that, as with any other country bent on maintaining a fixed exchange rate, North Korea would match the dollar outflow with a reduction in internal yuan credit, keeping the yuan equally scarce against the dollar, and thus the rate of exchange constant. So people don't have the yuan to buy the dollars. As people have become used to the stable rate, they don't speculate against it, so the regime doesn't have to spend much foreign exchange. But any movement invites speculation and a potential run on central bank reserves, hence the importance of the peg and any movement against it. I said this money stability was a major accomplishment of the Kim government, and it has added greatly to the increase in productive market activity. But there are heavy economic repercussions to restricting yuan credit, and in effect, an extremely tight monetary policy that would not allow lending to enterprises or even funding of any increases in the large government budget and the military. It keeps inflation low and the exchange rate stable, but there is little or no room for state-supplied investment or for pay increases needed to keep state workers from fleeing to the private sector. And this is what we see anecdotally: a country with virtually no industrial investment of the type normally provided by a socialist state, dilapidated train service, and terrible electric power and utility services, major healthcare concerns. The private sector may be growing, although it also may now be feeling the impact of reduced credit, as evidenced by declining apartment prices in Pyongyang. But the state sector is eroding much faster. We also see the state trying to raise funds by levying fees on everything and peeling off the employment obligations of state factories, allowing once socialist activities to become private. According to some, state factories can now pay market wages if they earn enough from their increasingly market-driven sales. This can go on for a long time, as it has in China, but inevitably it means a shift in resources and power to the private side of North Korea, a development we should all applaud. Efficiency would gain, people would prosper, and the authority of the state would weaken as real money fills people's pockets and as the pockets of private wealth and power crop up to compete against the party. Can the Kim regime survive such a dynamic? Maybe. He seems pretty clever. The Chinese like to say, once you jump on the capitalist tiger, you can't get off lest you be eaten. I say for Kim it's too late. The tiger is loose, and he better jump on and start feeding it, privatizing the state before he's eaten himself. I hope I made it in the time limit.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I'm nobody but a blind man touching an elephant. I'm just sharing the fragments of North Korea I have found for the time being. And I pretend to be very academic and systematic and analytic by bringing the analysis method. But in a conclusion, it has nothing meaningful or constructive at this moment, because North Korea changes rapidly, and on the other hand, it doesn't change at all. So our perspective and views of the North Korean economy particularly must be touched at micro and macro levels at the same time. Well, the existing accounts of the North Korean economy include two extreme ends of the estimation, positive and negative. Well, it's up to you which is more persuasive. But the extremely positive estimation groundlessly admits North Korean potentials to sustain and develop regardless of current internal and external conditions. The extremely negative one fallaciously warns of its imminent collapse, despite the fact that accuracy of estimation is severely compromised by the lack of necessary information of the society. Let me approach the North Korean economy at three levels of analysis. First one is leadership, second one is state, third one is international system. At the leadership level, it focuses on the influences of the dynastic power-inheriting dictator in North Korea as the most powerful determinant in economic policy making. At the state level, it focuses on the feature of the state. For example, working mechanism for policy operation, a system of power distribution, or institution building as the determining factor in running the economy. At the international system level, it focuses on the rules and norms of the international system under which individual states' economy, policy, planning, and implementing are constrained. At the leadership level, the positive estimation may argue that the Kim Jong-un is a very open-minded and very well-educated in a Western rich country, Switzerland, and he belongs to a young generation, and he has boldly changed the policy line from the military economy, simultaneous policy, to only economic development policy, so forth and so on. So with that leadership characteristics, North Korean economy is making progress every day, and it is showing the signals of development in the future. But negative estimation argues that Kim Jong-un took no official career before power transfer. And he is still attached with old generation, so old style of governance that features his regime. And furthermore, he is adopting the reign of terror in order to control the bureaucrats and to mobilize the people for production. And in Kim Jong-un's approach to North Korean economy, the negative estimation says that he subdues economy to politics and military still. At the state level, the positive estimation appraises that there is a hierarchical power structure in which top leader, Workers' Party, and cabinet are all coordinating and working together towards their nationally set goals. As institutions to operate economic policies, the Ministry of External Economic Relations were established in 2014, and special economic zones were designated in 2013 and 14, and laws were legislated and revised regarding the commercial banking and FDI and so forth and so on. As an agent to carry on the mission of economic achievement, the state-owned enterprises and donju are working in the field. But one of the characteristics of North Korean economic changes is the bottom-up marketization. But negative estimation of North Korean economy argues that the economy is divided by royal family, party, military, and cabinet. So cabinet-centered economic policy making is very much limited and has no enough influence over the society. And the negative estimation argues that there is no real delegation of power to the working level officers. Thus, there is no competent technocrat, and the bureaucrats and working level officers have a fear of policy failure. And furthermore, negative estimation argues that the markets in North Korea are well and carefully and tactically managed by the North Korean regime. At the international system level, the positive estimation estimates that the international economic system features free and fair trade, and the North Korean economy interacts with outside international the economy, and one of its neighbors, China, is showing growing economic power, and China-North Korean economic interactions are increasing and contributing to the development of the North Korean economy. North Korea is currently engaging the diplomatic negotiations with the USA over nuclear issues, but positive estimation predicts that upon the conclusion of the nuclear negotiations, North Korea-US economic cooperation will be realized in the future. In terms of inter-Korean relations, the positive estimation focuses on the South Korean initiative for peace building on the Korean Peninsula, and economic cooperation will be resumed soon, right after the nuclear negotiation. But negative estimation focuses on the fact that U.S.-China trade war or economic conflicts are increasing, and North Korea joins the group of countries who are leaning on the illicit economic behaviors. And at this moment, North Korea is receiving pressure from international sanctions. So North Korea has no viable options but to give up to the U.S. on nuclear issues, and the North Korea has no alternative or substitution to the vegetated centrally planned economy. Negative estimation also focuses on the fact that North Korean economy is an all state-centered business project, and in inter-Korean relations, their previous cooperation has generated no effect on North Korean economic reform so far. Having said that, positive and negative viewpoints at three different levels. For future engagement with North Korea, we may have to check the necessary conditions of a North Korean economy for further meaningful dialogue. What if North Korea completes denuclearization? Yeah, there will be a new way for dialogue on economic cooperation in the future. What if North Korea redefines the developmental state model, and which means that the redefinition of the authoritarian leadership and leader-bureaucrat relations, and the delegation of power to the working level officers and so on. If there are real changes in economy, that there will be chances for cooperation with the outside. What if North Korea resets control tower as South Korea experienced in the 1960s and 1970s? For example, under Park Chung-hee authoritarian leadership, the South Korean government established the Economic Planning Board as a control tower in order to mobilize human capitals and resources in order to achieve the national economic goals. What if North Korea pursues privatization, which is the main point of marketization? But North Korean marketization is very much limited in its definition now. But if privatization occurs in North Korea and property rights are secured in its society, the outside investors would actively approach that society. What if North Korea established commercial banking system? Outside investors and outside development assistant designers will engage with North Korean regime over development projects. What if North Korea opens strategic dialogues with neighboring countries and international financial institutions? The North Korean landscape of economy will be dramatically changed. In addition, I would like to add two more points. In comparison with Kim Jong-il either, Kim Jong-un, the regime has no powerful and effectively working technocrat, like Jang Song-taek, who established a well-efficient the strategy and structure to realize the economic plannings. And he built a bridge between North Korea and China by contacting political figures in China for economic purposes. Furthermore, Jang Song-taek created the conglomerate company. Well, it is not proper to say that, but it is a kind of a big company in its size, which was called the Taepung, Big Wind. It was analogous to South Korean chaebol. Its purpose might be probably the accumulation of capitals and obtains enough power to operate its business in North Korea. So the Kim Jong-un hasn't found no strong person like Jang Song-taek or no effective or efficient form like Taepung or anything like South Korean chaebol. So it is my suggestion to North Korea in order to upgrade and revise the North Korean economy. The North Korea needs to check the necessary conditions at different levels. Let me wrap up my presentation here, and I will come back to the Q&A session. Thank you.
I mean, when I was preparing these remarks, I did initially try really hard to keep it purely to the title and the topic of this first panel, which is on the North Korean economy itself. But then when I came to thinking about the implications of what I wanted to say for the future development of the economy, I mean, it's really hard to sort of approach the economy in an abstraction from the state, because it's all about how state policymakers respond to the particular challenges that they approach. So in some ways I've kind of strayed also into the topic of this afternoon's panels, which is a bit more about adaptation and reform strategies and things like that. But I think, you know, one of the biggest challenges, of course, that we face in the North Korean case, and Dr. Kim has already spoke about, you know, touching the elephant in the darkness, and this really is the case with North Korean analysis, because we just don't have detailed knowledge of the dynamics of policy making and bureaucratic politics within North Korea. And I think that sort of exaggerates the tendency whereby analysis sort of looks at the top leadership, looks at Kim Jong-un and you know, thinks about his personal history and all these kind of things. And this kind of exaggerates the tendency, I think, where North Korean studies, for good reason, is sort of 20 years behind you know, post-communist transition studies in elsewhere. By adopting this sort of very agent-centered approach, but then other trends in studies of other state socialist countries, you know, bringing in more sort of structural factors, comparisons, well, in this regard, thinking about legacies, and as I'll talk a bit about the sectoral composition of the economy and what that means for the way that the state responds. The first point I wanted to make, I mean, this. When we had the Hanoi summit, there was this kind of avalanche of opinion pieces about whether North Korea was going to follow the Vietnamese path of reform. But I'm not the first person to say this, but I think it's worth emphasizing that the distinctive feature of the North Korean economy is that it, sorry, get a bit closer. So in comparison to the other Asian communist countries, North Korea's challenge is fundamentally one of structural adjustment, rather than you know, approaching development for the first time. If you understand development as being this transition from a rural to agricultural to an urban industrialized economy. So Mitsuhiro Miyama, you know, he had this phrase that North Korea was the poorest advanced economy in the world, which I think captures the kind of the sort of specificity of the North Korean case quite well. Because, of course, North Korea, I mean, everybody knows this, I guess, but it underwent its industrialization in the 1950s, right? It probably, I haven't got the figures, but was probably one of the most cases of the most rapid transition to an urban industrialized economy, whereas China and Vietnam in the 80s were kind of, you know, still rural agrarian economies, which creates a very different kind of context. And it explains why I think most people would agree that North Korea's economic reform measures are very gradualistic, even compared to these other Asian communisms. But even when North Korean economic reform measures do resemble those carried out in China and in Vietnam and other places, the results are less impressive, because it's a much greater challenge to pursue this kind of structural adjustment. And so in that sense, of course, North Korea had much more in common, say, with the Eastern European economies in economic terms, perhaps not so much politically, but in any case. And there's a whole literature in political economy about the sectoral composition of economies and what kind of impact that has on the kind of state that you have. So if you have a country that has a leading sector which is very capital intensive and you know, has high economies of scale, then that has an impact on the state. It creates very strong linkages with the state and with those sectoral interests, because you have very high sunk costs in, say, basic heavy industries, which North Korea, of course, has a great deal of, very high exit barriers, greater fears of competition, and the state lacks the institutions you need to move into these kind of new, more promising sectors. And of course, staff bureaucrats, enterprise managers are very fearful of the possible of structural change, and they will resist it and have a very kind of conservative attitude towards this. And the state itself kind of defines the national interest as being the same as the interests of these capital-intensive sectors. So there's a tendency towards a very conservative attitude towards the status quo. So even if we don't know exactly what's going on in North Korea in terms of decision-making and bureaucratic politics, then we can sort of, North Korea is not actually counterintuitive. It's what we would expect. And this kind of approach to sectors and their impacts on states, it explains differences between countries, but even within countries. So if we look at China, for example, of course, under Deng Xiaoping's reforms, the original industrial heartland of China went into a period of continuous decline, which goes on until today, because of the dominance of state-owned enterprises, the dominance of heavy industry, legacies of strong central planning, which led to a very conservative attitude to reform. And in the early stages of reform, of course, in northeast China, there were memories of colonialism and these kind of things, and wariness of Japanese and South Korean investment early on. And we can simply, it's not surprising then that North Korea, I mean, it was part of the same process of colonial and industrialization, very similar characteristics between Northeast China. So it's no real surprise. So my argument is then that these structural legacies also influence reform, not just in the kind of reforms that are carried out, but also in the challenges that they face. And we can see this under Kim Jong-un's our-style economic management system, and I'll talk a bit in particular about the Socialist Enterprise Responsibility Management System, which is talked about a fair deal in North Korea. So, I mean, in some respects, despite, of course, North Korea's come to this quite late and it's approached reform in a very cautious manner, but the measures themselves are really just typical sort of market socialism kinds of measures. I mean, they're more reactive in the North Korean case because of actual, the collapse of the economy, of much of the economy in the 1990s. But nonetheless, again, there was an allusion to this already, that there's been a lot of legal changes in the North Korean legal system in the past few years. So, the enterprise law and the people's economy planning law have all been reformed, which on paper at least, does allow for a decentralization of decision-making rights and increased managerial incentives, and also follows on to labor incentives through the market socialism, through using the market, but for allegedly socialist kind of objectives. And in that regard, the sort of qualitative nature of the reforms is not that much different, although, of course, other countries have still faced these problems of reforming their state-owned enterprise sector. So under this system, the State Planning Commission still has a role, right? It's more constrained to simply handing down production and supply plans to state-owned enterprises, particularly in the strategic sectors. I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, through the Central Planning Index. And then other targets outside of the strategic sector are then sort of handed down. They're formulated by, say, regional governance levels, but also particularly to enterprises, and it's also an abolition of sort of in-kind indicators, but and a transition towards the word in North Korea that you read often, suiksong, profitability becomes a much more important objective. So ministries and regional organizations and enterprises have these kind of increased planning rights. So what this means is that, in theory at least, North Korean enterprises are much more responsible for their own performance, and they can devise their own plans and take care of production and sales and the management of their financial affairs. And they're also responsible for kind of supporting the livelihood of their workers in the non-strategic sectors. And also, as much more, these legal changes are about, bringing, they don't call them taxes, but they're basically taxes, and making sort of financial payments to the state. So in a sense, these enterprise reforms, on paper at least again, represent a departure from the old system, the Taean work system, which of course was the flagship management system of the Kim Il-sung government from the 1960s. And even this year, I understand that the Taean work system has actually been removed from the constitution and replaced with the socialist enterprise responsibility management system, which also suggests that actually the kind of Yuhun Tongji is not as prohibitive as sometimes we might think. It doesn't prevent these kind of innovations. So there's more sort of decision-making rights which are handed down to enterprises in the non-strategic sector, and which have increased the role of market dynamics, market prices in the management of those enterprises. And also, interestingly, there's actually in the enterprise law is an explicit mention now that enterprises are allowed to receive investments from private individuals. They don't use the word tonju or entrepreneurs, but they will say idle money held by private individuals, right? Which is a kind of recognition of a practice that's already been taking place anyway because of the collapse in much of the economy of central planning. So in this respect, I mean, this is a change, at least in terms of the way that the North Korean government thinks about enterprise management, which of course, how far it's implemented is another question. And you can see, I won't talk about it now, but you can see similar sort of ideas in the agricultural, in the collective farm reforms. But again, of course, it's limited. I mean, the farms are still there. There's still collective farming and these kind of things. But I think this mentions this key context of reform takes place in again, as was mentioned, in a context of marketization. And of course, I'm sure everybody knows this. This is one of the biggest transformations since the 1990s. It's often referred to as a process of marketization from below, particularly in the early stages, reflecting a kind of survival mechanism. But I think as time goes on, it's more accurate to refer to it as an emergence of a state-market nexus, right? Because it's the state has kind of interacted with this process, and the state, particularly under Kim Jong-un, is trying to take advantage of market dynamics in order to pursue state-type goals. So, I mean, obviously, extracting financial resources from the market, like I said, new forms of taxes and what have you, and to address the chronic fiscal crisis, and to use those resources for strengthening the state sector. So what you actually see is more something, rather than sort of market forces pushing the state from below, is something much more of a mutually dependent relationship between the Tonju and state officials, particularly at lower levels as well. And these are expressed through hybrid property rights. So, for example, with private participation in state-owned enterprises, you get this process of wearing the red cap. The phrase comes from China, but a situation where because you have this continued prohibition of the private means of production, then the Tonju have no choice but to invest in state entities, and so the property rights, in that sense, allow investors to have use and control of their assets. And this is a kind of mutual interest as well, right? Because the Tonju, on the one hand, they gain access to the means of production, they gain political protection in the absence of private property rights. But then the state entities, of course, they are able to overcome this endemic problem that they've always had, but particularly after the 1990s, of the supply of materials and capital. So in this regard, as the Chinese origins of that term suggests, there's a lot of parallels there between the early reform period in China. But what I want to emphasize is particularly the unevenness of marketization in that regard, because it's sometimes talked about as if it's something that's across the board and affecting the whole economy. But those legacies, those structural sectoral legacies of heavy industrialization mean that there's quite a degree of unevenness within the North Korean economy. So much of the centrally planned economy did sort of collapse in the 90s, but the state has continually emphasized the recovery of the strategic industries, so that defense, of course, is a key sector, but energy and rail and large state-owned enterprises and heavy industry, all those sectors that are considered absolutely crucial for state and system maintenance, and still largely are regarded as part of the planned economy. Nonetheless, on the other hand, of course, as I mentioned, you get the smaller regional enterprises that tend to get quite little in the way of state support. Kim Jong-un visits a lot of light industrial enterprises on his kind of on-the-spot guidance tours, and he talks about the importance of developing consumer products that people need. But I'm not sure there's a great deal of evidence of actual state investment for those kind of enterprises. And this is, in a sense, I think, the dual meaning of self-reliance. We usually think of North Korean self-reliance as the country's relationship to the international system, but it's also a reflection of the reality whereby enterprises in non-strategic sectors are pretty much expected to kind of fend for themselves and kind of support their workers and you know, use private capital to do that. So you see that a kind of a great, it's geographically differentiated as well, because you know, a lot of these strategic enterprises are in places like Chagang province, where the centrally planned economy is still quite strong, but then in a lot of you know, Pyongan province and other places, it's a much more marketized and kind of less reliance on the state. And so I'd say that the Kim Jong-un reforms are also about kind of pursuing this dualistic industrial structure kind of approach. And I think if you look at North Korean publications, if you look at the Kyungjae Yeongu journal, I mean, the North Korean economists are quite explicit about this dualisms. They talk about the need to normalize production in the strategic sector. They talk about, you know, supplying key materials and, you know, such things as cement and steel and coal and electricity and all this kind of thing, and the importance of the Central Plan Index. They say that exchange of materials between enterprises can take place, but nonetheless in the strategic sector, that's just a supplementary measure. It's not the main mode by which those big, large, kind of capital-intensive heavy industries are supposed to operate. But then on the other hand, the socialist enterprise responsibility management system has kind of, to some extent, officially, on paper at least, expanded kind of enterprise autonomy. And of course, there's a political dimension to that as well, because the large enterprises have large workforces. It's important for political control to try to keep that within the sort of state centrally planned system. So that's mainly what I wanted to say in terms of the content. And so just to summarize, I think you know often we look at sort of Kim Jong-un, or we look at international factors and try to reason from there. But I think we can also bring into the analysis the kind of structural sectoral legacies of the North Korean economy, and thinking about the prospect for reform. I think it explains the cautious conservative nature of reform in North Korea. But nonetheless, we do see that reforms are increasingly resembling the kinds of market socialist measures that we've seen elsewhere in other state socialist countries. But North Korea faces that particular challenge in the sense that, Alexander Gershon talked about the advantages of backwardness, which North Korea doesn't really possess because it did industrialize much earlier, and it faces those much greater challenges of structural adjustment. But reforms kind of do serve to promote marketization, but Kim Jong-un is not Milton Friedman. He's kind of pro-market to the extent that the market can be utilized to strengthen the state sector. So I think I'll just finish there. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin Gray. Okay. I would like to spend a few minutes to just summarize the three papers you just heard this morning. First, the presentation by the Bill Newcomb gave us an excellent summary of the important change in North Korean economy, focusing on the trade and the foreign exchange rate, and the implications of UN sanctions on its monetary system. North Korea has changed from a largely communist-style ration system with no real money in circulation to partially dollarized system today. The money circulates freely, but it's an informal way, an informal market. So there seems to be a problem that the communist style ration system conflicts with the market system used by the growing number of private citizens. And the Jung-ho Kim argued that due to the extremely limited access to the information, the North Korean economy has been miscomprehended and misrepresented in many ways. The question of how the North Korean economy has survived and may sustain was reassessed at the three levels of analysis: leadership, state, and foreign relations. And finally, Kevin Gray's paper examined the current state of the North Korean economy and to what extent North Korea is likely to pursue its own policy of reform and opening up. So this paper adopted a structurally focused framework that placed the country in comparative perspective to argue that the post-colonial nationalism of North Korean state combined with country's distinctive economic structure will have a significant impact on the strategy of integration with the world economy. So basically, the other paper is about the kind of the development model focusing on the marketization for its future policy choices. Okay, so now let's proceed to the floor discussion. So if you have questions and comments, please raise your hand and identify yourself. If your questions and comments are specific to one of our speakers, you can tell us the name of the speakers from whom you want to hear. Okay, please.
Hi, Andrew Yo, Catholic University, and I'm honored to be first to bat here. My question is for Dr. Gray. Welcome back to Washington. So I'm a historical institutionalist, so I buy into these arguments about structural legacies and path dependency. And I mean, it's interesting how you mentioned that North Korea had already industrialized, so in some ways that is inhibiting North Korea from pushing forward with reforms. But at the same time, when you look at historical institutional arguments, they talk a lot about critical junctures, they talk about exogenous shocks and crises, and that should actually break up the old system, the old way of thinking. And we've seen that with the famine in the 1990s. And so there have been market reforms after that. So there have been limited reforms, but yet at the same time, you are still arguing that it's still an industry, they focus on heavy industries, and they're probably bureaucrats that are wedded to the previous ways of, the previous economic structures. So I was wondering if you could kind of square the two things and maybe discuss why we haven't seen more of a break from the past, given how devastating this crisis was to the North Koreans. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a few more questions and comments, and then our speakers will respond to first set of questions. Please.
I'm Linda Yar from here at George Washington University. I'm curious, this follows a bit on Andrew's question. To what extent do we see attention paid to these other sectors like fisheries and agriculture as being, coming under increased stress from climate change, for example? But also, do we see any sign of confidence among population in terms of increasing the total fertility rate? Are people having more children? Is there that sense of change, in terms of demographics as well?
Okay, I get this.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Billington with Executive Intelligence Review. I'm wondering, outside of Kaesong, not considering that, to what extent do any of you have a sense that the chaebol in the South are planning or looking ahead towards their ability to invest, both in the big infrastructure, the railroads, but also perhaps in industry and industrialized agriculture and things of that sort?
Okay, so let's respond to the first set of questions. So let's start from the Kevin Gray.
Okay. Thank you. So the question about critical junctures, I think that's, and I guess it's a comparative question as well, because for many countries, the 1990s were a critical conjuncture. I mean, I made the comparison between North Korea and Eastern Europe in terms of their industrial structure, but politically, of course, they're very, very different, right? And it reflects the kind of I guess the specificity of North Korea in terms of being a kind of, I mean, you mentioned in your final remarks about the post-colonial nationalism, which I didn't actually get to in my talk, but that is, of course, the political distinctiveness of North Korea as being a post-colonial nation, which kind of sets it apart from Eastern Europe, and it created a much greater commitment to sort of national survival through the means of catch-up industrialization. And in the 1990s, I mean, I guess that's one of the reasons, among several, is the reasons why the regime didn't collapse. And it also, of course, you know, the sort of threat perception. Okay, I mean, you know, people talk about North Korea's threat perception. I mean, it has kind of internal kind of uses, I guess, in terms of maintaining its authoritarian position. But I don't think you can deny the fact that North Korea does feel under threat, even though it may have contributed to that in some regards. It's a similar debate we used to have about the Soviet Union as well, about whether it was kind of aimed on dominating the world with global communism, or whether it was actually quite a weak country that was just trying to maintain its rule. But anyway, my point is yeah, so I guess the political dimensions, and that's also, you know, many people have written about how the sort of breakthrough in the international environment in China and Vietnam also allowed that critical juncture to take place as well, right? So, I mean, in Vietnam in particular, of course, Vietnam was very different from North Korea in the sense that Vietnam won the Vietnam War and North Korea didn't. So, so that also adds to this. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what more I can say to that. On the other questions, I'm not sure. Perhaps I could leave that to my co-presenters.
I guess maybe it's good idea to for the Jung-ho Kim respond regarding, like, you know, 재벌 investment or agriculture, fishery, or population aging, etc.
Okay, thank you for the question. Well, in order to carry any business mission, there must be a set of necessary conditions, including enough human capitals and money and the infrastructure and system. But for example, the North Korean regime designated more than 24 of special economic zones over the land of North Korea. But we deeply explored the viability of the project with the SEG, but there was no enough the manpower, and there was no foreign investment at all, and there was no necessary infrastructure that built towards the special economic zones. Of course, we detected a dozen of Chinese companies who showed interest in the development of special economic zones, but they just stayed at the stage of negotiation about the conditions of cooperation. They didn't go further, including the bringing actual money into the North Korean economy. Another example would be mining business. So many Chinese businessmen invested and even put the roads and railways to the mining places, but they lost their investment and they withdrew with empty hands. So in order to raise the kind of chaebol in North Korea, it needs to receive the policy attention from the top leader and the bureaucracy readjustment towards the business project, and of course the working level officers and the entrepreneurs must exist for the comprehensive cooperation.
Thank you. Bill Newcomb.
Thank you. Really good question, Andrew. I like that. North Korea's industrial base was destroyed in the 90s. It totally collapsed. Most of the economy collapsed as well at that time. And so at the moment of all this collapse, I mean, it gave an opportunity for reform that never took place until the, what I called at the time, the stealth reforms of 2002, right? Which could have done more if they were more complete. But if you go back and look at what they did in 2002, they said they were going to do something in finance, at least they mentioned that on a Tokyo visit, but they never did. And so perhaps it was because they had lost control over finance, because the collapse of the industrial system caused the collapse of the party structure, which was factory-based. It caused the collapse of the revenue system because that's where the government was getting its funds. So it was very, very important. A similar thing happened in China. If you're to set up Chinese reform, a Chinese economist named Shui Chao wrote an expose of what went on. And from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, China followed an industrial policy called the third line. And what the third line meant was that factories that were located on the coast, which China thought were vulnerable to foreign military action and so forth, were moved inland. They were relocated in remote valleys and underground. Well, that means you've got huge transportation expenses. Factories located underground have humidity problems, and they're really hard to expand. So for 10 years, they had a negative return on investment in industry. Think about that. China's return on investment was negative for 10 years. And so finally, this was brought to light, and that, in effect, gave impetus to some of the reforms that took place. In North Korea, because of the association of the policies with the leadership, they couldn't make that kind of break from the past. In fact, I'm kind of shocked by what was mentioned about the Taeyin work system being phased out, because that's so closely associated with Kim Il-sung, right? So maybe we're going to see some changes in the future where they start carefully disassociating themselves from the legacies of the past. Turning very quickly, I think there's some experimentation in agriculture, but not enough yet. People tend to make too much of it, and until we see the state farms being privatized, until we see the cooperatives being turned into more family plots, until we see more fertilizer being supplied in a market system, more pesticides, more insecticides, and more progress in getting rid of the salt. Remember all that reclaimed sea land? It's saturated with salt, and that has an effect on crops, right? So until we see something like that, a more careful cultivation of hillsides, I mean, look when the famine started back in the 90s. What progress has North Korea made in feeding itself in the meantime? Now, small countries, they trade, right? They don't try to be self-reliant in agriculture. North Korea has not really developed the trade. It still preaches this juche. It takes what it needs. It still suffers annually, and particularly this year, from food deficits, right? I mean, it's the longest running client state in the world. Then on the question about demography, I mean, I'm not a demographer. I actually had a conversation with Nick Eberstadt about this very issue not long ago. And according to Nick, the North Koreans have begun massaging their demographic information because of what was able to be exploited from it earlier. And so I think it's really hard to tell right now what's going on in terms of birth rates and so forth. I mean, the UN statistics that they supply, right, are about the best that's available right now. So I can't answer it, but I would subject anyone's answer to serious scrutiny, right? And then finally, about what the Chaebol are looking at. raw materials, right? North Korea at one time had a great metallurgy industry, and it was based upon local raw materials. So they're looking for that. They're looking at transport. They're looking at power. But it's basic stuff, and they're looking at exploiting cheap labor. And I guess everyone dreams of the rare earth elements, but that's kind of like Bolivia, right? The king sitting on the golden throne that nobody really can exploit. I mean, it takes serious money to make money from rare earth elements. So thank you.
Okay, so let's move on to the second round of questions, please.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. France pioneered a system in which they rent out large tracts of land in Africa and pay decent rents for the land and then grow crops which are exported directly to France using local labor, which makes the recipient country quite happy. China has now started doing this as well. Could we see China renting large tracts of land in North Korea using local labor to offset the need to continuously transfer food from China to North Korea?
Okay, Dean Yu, please.
I couldn't resist asking this question. I was very struck by the trade figures, and over the last couple of years, the imports of investment goods practically disappeared. So we hear some improvement of living standards, but maybe you can go on like that for some time. But if you know this disappearance of investments, it cannot be sustained, right? Also, given the large deficit, trade deficits, you know, you can go on by belt tightening, but you are going to run out of your foreign exchange reserves sooner or later. So what happens then? Maybe they can fend off speculation until the last minute, but there is going to be a last minute. So I was wondering, you know, given the severe sanctions that are you know, producing these kind of effects, you know, can supposing that the maximum pressure sanctions continue, can North Korea really, you know, survive? How long is it going to be before they face an outbreak of very serious economic crisis?
Okay, lady at the center table, please.
I'm Grace Kong of the Institute for Korean American Studies and former State Department. I was particularly intrigued by Professor Gray's comments on legal changes. My question is, in order for international business entities to ever invest in North Korea seriously, it would need much stronger confidence in the North Korean legal system. Did you see any movement towards trying to change laws to make it more attractive to international business?
Okay, let me take one more question. Okay, please.
Hi, thank you. Song-hee Kim from Wilson Center. My question is about foreign debt of North Korea that started to increase from 1974 or 1975. Do you think the foreign debt of North Korea, how big challenge is it on North Korea's economic development? Do you think it's what restrained the international community to invest in North Korea or not?
Okay, so
Hear that? I'm sorry. I
Oh,
couldn't
so-
hear, I'm sorry.
So my question is, do you think how big challenge is it for North Korea to face the foreign debt from West Europe countries and Japan? That is it making North Korea economic development more difficult, or do we have to pay more attention to it?
Okay, let's respond from the Kevin Gray.
Okay, so the first question was about possible foreign investors in North Korean agriculture and leasing out land and that kind of thing. It makes sense as a strategy. I would imagine if you suggested that to a North Korean sort of leader, they might not be overly keen on the idea, right? I mean, it's political, the biggest barrier to that. I mean, they place a strong emphasis on the sort of socialist land property system, and when you look at what the reasons for the purging of Changsong Tech was much about sort of renting out land to China at too cheap rates. So I think it's something that would require quite a large political change for that sort of strategy. But yeah, I appreciate. I'll just answer the penultimate question about legal changes in international business. So yeah, there have been changes to the enterprise law that now sort of, again, I keep saying on paper at least, because we don't really know actually to what extent these legal changes carry through to exactly how enterprises operate. But officially, Article 37 of the enterprise law now states that enterprises are able to establish freely joint ventures with foreign enterprises. So it's theoretically possible then for North Korean enterprises to receive foreign investments and these kind of things. But which is a shift from the more restrictive system in the past. For example, you had to have a permit, I think it was called a waku or something. I don't know exactly where that word comes from, but it's kind of official permit for trade. But obviously these are the legal changes, but you still have all these kind of requirements that are likely to scare off investors. For example, I mean, if a foreign investor visits North Korea, he has to have a minder, he has to have a driver, he has to have all these what are effectively non-tariff barriers, right, which are not going to be appealing, and of course legal protections for investments as well. I mean, I don't know of anything that actual concrete changes that's changed that. So there's still very much the sort of old way of thinking that, yeah, we'll have your money and when you have your capital and technology, but without providing the proper protections for that. And that's why, obviously foreign investment has happened, but it's mainly been through very small scale businesses in China's northeast that are able to negotiate those kind of lack of clear rules and things like that. And for the time being, I think that's likely to be, if sanctions are relaxed to some extent, that's likely to be the format through which foreign investment takes place in North Korea, rather than if we think of it, large sort of multinationals and things like that. So yeah.
Okay, Jung-ho Kim, please.
I want to answer Dr. Yu's question. International sanctions drains North Korea the position of a hard currency. It is impossible to accurately estimate how much they have at this moment, but many academic guessings bring about a picture of a North Korean hard currency within the range of from the at least $1 billion to $5 billion, but it's not accurate. But anyway, of course, international sanctions they cause the North Korean drainage on that, and without hard currency, North Korean economy will fall down and have no capacity to import from the international market. In the end, in an extreme case, the North Korean economy will be colonized by China, because China money has intruded North Korean economy for over 20 years at least. And as an evidence to support that the North Korean trade with China has featured huge amount of a trade deficit over 2 decades, at least $1 to $2 billion a year. So many the experts try to finish the puzzling by bringing the academic guessings and analysis. Probably North Korean trade deficit might be counterbalanced or compromised by the Chinese ODA fund or policy assistance that might not appear in the official statistics. Nonetheless, North Korea will face the problem that will cause the collapse of the North Korean economy in the future. But the North Korea has been trying to find ways to various sources of money abroad through the international system with the help of China. Well, at this moment, we are predicting that all the North Korean laborers must go home by the end of this year. But they are trying to create alternatives and substitutions to the previous ways. For example, the labor visa will be changed with student visa, and North Korean people go abroad continually, and they continue their business in different ways. Well, it is a difficult question and a difficult task to solve. Let me add one short comment on the question about the foreign debt. The North Korean foreign debt that was around $15 billion according to academic guessing, but about $10 billion were canceled by Russia 5 years ago, and the South Korea made a state loan to North Korea that was around less than $2 billion. North Korea, they stopped talking about paying the loan back to South Korea when the inter-Korean relations deteriorated in 2009, 2010. But that will be a future issue that will bother North Korea severely. So South Korea joined the Paris Club that will talk about national debt, foreign debt. So South Korea will discuss with international society about the issues of North Korean debt. If it is not the present, yeah, it will occur sooner or later in the future.
Oh, some great questions. Let me just continue on with the foreign debt. When the conditions are right, and there are a lot of conditions that have to change for them to be right, yeah, you'll have a Paris Club. You'll also have to have a London Club to clear the books and get North Korea ready to become credit-worthy again, because it is far from being credit-worthy in the eyes of any international lender. And of course, any potential investor should be looking at the history of previous investors in North Korea, many of which have had very unhappy endings. To go back about China and renting land, not unprecedented. North Korea housed foreign counterfeit cigarette plants. Right? So in effect, it was renting space for that. I could see Chinese land experiments up in the special economic zone of Rason. I can't see it elsewhere in the company. And I think despite sensitivities about China, they have cooperated with China in the past. We've got the ore from Musan being transported back to China. We've got China investing in the port of Changchun and rebuilding piers and so forth there. And of course, with Russia, they worked on the rail lines. So North Korea is open to sort of restricted, very focused sorts of cooperation. But I certainly don't see North Korea looking favorably upon China coming down into the Rice Bowl area and doing anything there. Excellent question about investment and debt. They haven't been investing in a long time. I mean, think about gross national income, and let's just divide it up. Consumption, investment, government spending, which includes the military, which includes the nuclear, which is quite expensive, right? Consumption's been going up a little bit, so we don't have figures on investment, but we don't see any results from investment, right? Where's the chemical industry? They used to be really good in inorganic chemicals, right? I mean, they bought it all from East Europe, and they had a very quite viable industry up in Hamhung and so forth. It's not there. Where's the metallurgy? North Korea used to be a big steel producer. What do they sell now? Iron ore, right? They're not capable of getting the value added because the plants have deteriorated except for the missile plants. Aluminum, well, that goes to missiles, right? It's not going out. What do they produce? Cement, right? Where's it going? It's going into big buildings. It's not being exported. And then sanctions have migrated from being what were called smart sanctions and targeted, and they've been creeping back toward the more comprehensive, because now you have the sectoral sanctions, right? On the raw materials, the old traditional exports, you know, and graphite and talc and agricultural goods now, textiles. So North Korea's being sort of hammered there. At the same time, it's improved domestic supply. So the people have a spin-off benefit. The unintended consequences of sanctions work both ways, right? People just tend to look upon them working one way. So what about this trade deficit? Well, I have a feeling that China is accumulating a lot of it, just like they did back when they were trading as planned systems, just like the Russians did when they were trading as planned systems. I think Bill mentioned in his paper about other sources of income from services, worker remittances. We have that. Let's not forget arms sales. Let's not forget the cooperation with Syria, where they sell chemical weapons, know-how, precursors, and so forth. The arms plants that are producing weapons under license in Ethiopia and Eritrea, all of that kind of cooperation with Iran, which probably is not a freebie. The sales to sub-Saharan Africa, which continue. North Koreans are still in the ground in Senegal and other places. MOP is operating under another name. So all of this is income generating. And then something that nobody really talks about, North Korea is a gold producer. Now, my rule of thumb is that it's capable of producing about 5 tons a year. Now, gold exports are sanctioned. They are not allowed to do it anymore. North Korea used to put its mark on it for the gold exchange, but marks on gold bars are real easy to counterfeit. It's just that you have to move them through illicit means. So instead of market prices, I mean, my rule of thumb, and it's very subjective, I don't have any objective way of going after it, is that they take about a 20% haircut on revenues that they would get from gold sales. So that's factoring in there too. So you have these other flows, and then the accumulating debt, because China has North Korea's assistance, or its assistance to North Korea, sort of on a rheostat. It wants enough pressure to make North Korea keep changing, but it doesn't want so much pressure that it brings down the house of cards. So I think we see this kind of balancing act, and it's crude, right? You're going to overdial and underdial. You're not going to get it exactly right. So you're going to see fluctuations. And I think well, the point Bill made was exactly right. The last nuclear test was much too much for Beijing, and they really wanted to send a message, although they're starting to lighten up a little bit now by permitting, breaches and sanctions on coal and crude oil and so forth. Did I get every? Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on to the third round of questions, please allow me to participate in the discussion in this round of questions by sharing some numbers about the economic impact of the sanctions against North Korea. From 2016 to 17, the UN Security Council adopted 5 measures imposing sanctions against the North Korea, banning all exports of coal and other material resources, fisheries, and textile products to the regime, and limiting North Korean imports of crude oil and refined petroleum. So the stronger sanctions covered an estimated 90% of North Korean exports, and required the UN member states to expel North Korean workers within 24 months of adoption, which means by December this year actually. So this is expected to strain the regime's access to foreign currencies. So due to these strong sanctions on North Korea, the volume of North Korea's trade dropped sharply in 2017, and its GDP growth rate also recorded a large negative figure. So in 2017, the exports, basically the North Korean exports basically with China, its exports decreased by 37% year on year, and its economy shrank by around 3.5%, and which is the lowest growth rate since 1997. Although the North Korea trade volume fell further in 2018, its market exchange rate and the prices of major items remain surprisingly relatively stable. So between January and in 2018, the North Korea's exports and imports from China were 88% and 34% lower, respectively, than in the previous year. However, the North Korea, the market exchange rate, because the formal exchange rate is different from the market exchange rate, which is informal market. So market exchange rate was 8,200 North Korean won per dollar, just 2% higher year on year. And the price of rice, for instance, was about 5,000 Korean won per kilogram, which is just 10% lower. So when we actually we looked at the foreign exchange rate against the US dollar, it sharply dropped this year, maybe more than 10%. But we have to pay cautious on the implication of that, because this year, not only North Korea but also many other countries, their currency has been depreciated against the US dollar. So we really do not know whether this sharp depreciation of North Korean won is just because of sanctions or lack of the foreign reserve, or just the global market trend. So anyway, I don't know how long the North Korean economy can survive the very strong economic sanction, but it seems very clear to me that the Chairman Kim Jong-un's will to achieve the economic development is strong. So I believe he is very well aware that the economic development cannot be achieved without the progress in the negotiations on denuclearization and lifting up the very strong economic sanctions. Okay, so let's take the third round of questions, please.
Jong-un, Howard University. I deal with issues of migration and forced migration. One of the questions that I have for you is, I guess any of the three on the panelists. North Korea sends out migrant workers. And when they send out migrant workers, they often generate a lot of capital on behalf of the government. I had experiences with them in the early 2000s working for an NGO, especially in Vladivostok. In your opinion, will this practice be continued? And how much capital do you think these migrant workers are generating on behalf of North Korea?
Okay, next.
My name is John Merrill. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Institute for Korean Studies. I was formerly at the State Department. I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. I'm glad that the question of the sanctions finally came up on this last panel. My own opinion is that sanctions have negative effects, that they retard the transition that North Korea is trying to make to new ways of organizing the economy. I think another negative effect, which is never talked about, is that they encourage elements in the regime to move into illicit activities. I think Bill might agree with that. I haven't heard anyone talk about the signs that North Korean-Japanese relations are on a warming trend. You saw this with the remarks by Prime Minister Abe in New York a couple of days ago. You saw it with the big delegation from the Japanese Medical Association, which is headed by a very close friend of Prime Minister Abe's. And you saw it with the big delegation headed by Prime Minister Kanemaru's son that was also just up there. So I'd like people to maybe talk a little bit about the negative effects or unintended effects of sanctions in encouraging illicit activities. And Bill, you usually like to talk about illicit activities, but I haven't heard you attach any numbers to that problem on this panel. And so I wonder if you could do that.
Thank you. My name is Ji-Hoon Lim. I'm an intern in the Wilson Center. I have a question about North Korea's accounting system. So, because I guess it is one of the key components to attract the investments, especially FDI, whether the country has a proper, reliable accounting system. So my question is, what's North Korea's accounting system? What does it look like, and is it rational enough to produce a accurate or transparent information to investors outside so they could trust in North Korea when they decided to put their money in North Korea? Thank you.
Was there somebody who had a question over there? No? Okay, so let's respond. I'm sorry, but Kevin Gray, again.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Just on terms of the negative impacts of sanctions, I guess sanctions are designed to have negative impact. It depends what you mean by a negative impact, right? But I guess unintended consequences is one thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think obviously sanctions do undermine any sort of nascent process of reform in North Korea. I don't think that's surprising. But at the same time, of course, sanctions up until 2016 weren't all that onerous. I mean, there were still many sectors that North Korea could have pursued more proactively if it wished to. And again, coming back to my point about very cautious, gradualistic reforms, that perhaps equally prevented North Korea from pursuing that kind of path. In terms of illicit activities, I mean, I did kind of write a paper on the impact of sanctions on cross-border economic relations between China and North Korea, and it was clear that sanctions, particularly financial sanctions, were undermining earlier attempts by the Chinese government to try to regularize and formalize its financial and, including trade finance and these kind of things with its neighboring countries, including North Korea. So now of course, trade that does take place is pretty much based on cash and on barter and these kind of things, and that ties in with it's not just the North Korean case. I mean, the sanctions literature shows that this has often been an impact in the, during the former Yugoslavia in the 90s. They led to the criminalization of trade and these kind of things. So yeah, I mean, but I guess the question is then, of course, sanctions do have these impacts, but then they need to be balanced on how likely those sanctions are then to be successful. Will they actually achieve their objectives? I mean, sanctions do, by their very definition, need to exert some kind of pressure on the country, economic pressure. But so then that's a political question about whether sanctions actually, what are the political mechanisms whereby sanctions translate into policy change? But I think the problem with North Korea is that you can exert all kinds of, pressure, and we talk about, is there going to be a North Korea collapse? But how do, in a country like North Korea, which is highly authoritarian and doesn't really have much division in elites in terms of the policies that it's taking, it seems to me that North Korea is one of the least likely cases of a country that's least susceptible to sanctions, and I think that's a particular problem that sanctions face. And just there was a question about Again, I think it was a question about the sort of investment climate in North Korea. I think you're getting at, and I think, I mean, of course, we can say that North Korea needs to reform itself to become a full-blown free market economy that guarantees the rule of law and all these kind of things. Now, that's not been the case actually in most transition cases. If we look at China in the 70s and 80s, I mean, there was no rule of law there. I mean, people talked about the lack of property rights and all this kind of stuff. I mean, China was kind of well placed in some sense because it had this kind of ethnic Chinese community based in Southeast Asia and China who were able to kind of mediate between foreign capital and China. And North Korea doesn't really have that. It doesn't have that sort of overseas Korean community that could play this role. I mean, obviously South Korea, but the nature of the division and everything, it doesn't play that role. And other overseas communities like overseas ethnic Korean communities in Japan who have played a role in the 80s after the reforms there. They were the main investors in North Korea, but they don't really play that role that the ethnic Chinese could play, overseas Chinese could play in China. So I think, North Korea is disadvantaged situationally in the sense of having this kind of group that can mediate in that regard. But yeah, anyway, I'll leave it there.
Jong-un?
I would touch the issue of the North Korean economy system in general. Two features of North Korean economy would be said easily: much corruption, less transparency. Regarding the issues of FDI, North Korean economy has no proper conditions for interacting with foreign investors. There were two cases. Foreign investors tried to bring their their business profits from North Korea to their homeland, but they failed. Of course, besides the Chinese case, there were two cases. One was a South Korean business in North Korea, which was called the Pyeonghwa Ja동cha, the automobile business that was invested by the Unification Church organization. They successfully brought an example of some business profit out of North Korea, but it was it, and no more than that. And Egyptian telecommunication company that invested in North Korea tried to bring profits out of North Korea, but they were stopped by the authority in North Korea. So in the sense that they are not equipped with necessary conditions and institutions to interact with the outside yet.
Let me work backwards on the questions. On the economic system, we're not going to see a system that's really open to any foreign investor. We're not going to see a lot of information being provided. We're not going to see significant changes in the legal system. We're not going to be seeing anytime soon shifts in property rights. So let's say that we have an evolution in the international environment where foreign investment becomes possible, but we haven't seen these kinds of changes. What kind of investor is going to go into North Korea? Well, one that can put in money it can afford to lose, right? So that it can walk away because it doesn't want to invest and then become a hostage to its investment, a mistake Korean firms have made, of course. Two, you want to have a very early break-even point, right? You don't want to be looking 10 years down the road. You want to be looking 18 months, 24 months down the road to break even before you start getting a rate of return. And so that dictates the kinds of investment that projects that you're willing to entertain. And then since there are no property rights, you try and insinuate yourself with the leadership, right? Well, look what happened to Chongsong Tech, because a lot of foreign firms, Chinese firms, insinuated themselves with Chongsong Tech. That was a problem. And it's not only there. Classic case, Arm & Hammer, Occidental Petroleum. He had great experience in Soviet Russia. He tries to translate that to China. They go in and they make this huge investment. He's really tight with the leadership in Beijing, and they took him to the cleaners, right? Because they didn't include his project in the plan. So it was no longer legal, so he couldn't get transport, and so Occidental Petroleum had a huge write-off to make in China, right? And we saw what happened with the Roscom that Jong-un just mentioned. So, you know, it's an investment that only the most adventurous and risk takers, I think, could entertain. North Korea-Japan warming trend. I see the same thing. John and I are old partners in crime, so we've worked together for a long number of years. And I see that, but I also continue to see the impediment of the abduction issue. I don't see how Abe can get around that internally as a political problem without some kind of cooperation from the North Koreans to give him space to do more and to get rid of, I mean, right now Japan forbids all trade with North Korea, and the illicit trade that goes on is conducted via China, right, in an indirect way, and the financing's all indirect. So possibilities, but we've seen moves toward this in the past that came up empty. So I think we need to see some kind of reciprocity on North Korea's part. And then sanctions. Yeah, sanctions have a negative effect. No question about it. Can they encourage illicit activities? Yes. And we're seeing that. It used to be that what we saw was a lot of counterfeiting, supernote. That still goes on, I'm told, but I don't know the extent of it anymore. But generally it circulates through casinos and so forth. North Korea gets a cut, but it's really passing it on, so the amount it makes from it is less than it used to be. Narco trafficking, we're not seeing quite so much of that, but North Korea is still a meth producer. If you ever see a case where methamphetamine's been seized and it's white, that means it's pure, that means it's pharmaceutical grade, and that kind of points the finger right at North Korea. Whereas the shabu and so forth is brown, and that's more kitchen grade. And some of it could be coming from North Korea, but it's not really coming from the industrial part of North Korea. And usually it's coming out of China and other places. Counterfeit cigarettes, big earner, very low penalties. Probably still goes on. The cigarette industry publicizes it episodically because they don't want to undermine faith in their brands, but occasionally they go out and they make an example of it. But what do we have now? Look at the latest August report by the UN panel of experts, the midterm, and it details the profits North Korea is making from cyber theft, right? And they gave a figure of 2 billion, which I I suspect is an accumulated gross. I haven't gone in and tried to add up all the incremental parts to that, but I think it's a good rough working figure. So yeah, they're making money illicitly, and to an extent, it's caused by sanctions. But North Korea didn't begin participating in illicit activities because of sanctions, right? They were doing this back in the 1970s. They were doing it in the 1980s. They were doing it in the 1990s. The meth trade with Japan was by the shipload in the late 1990s. The first international sanction on North Korea wasn't until 2006. So North Korea would consider anything fair game to raise a dollar. And the negative effects of sanctions, I think, is, again, you have some positive effects on the internal availability of commodities and so forth. And finally, sanctions aren't that tough yet. You think they are. You read what the measures contain. But roughly half of UN member states have actually implemented sanctions. Right? There are various reasons why they haven't. They're supposed to, right? I mean, these are Article 7 measures, but they haven't, or Chapter 7, Article 41 measures. But the states, some of them think it's not my problem. Others lack capacity. Others lack political will. Some suffer from intimidation of other big states about not really enforcing some of the sanctions. So you have all of these reasons, and then North Korea has adapted to sanctions through a lot of very sophisticated evasion methods, which include operations of front companies overseas. So we're really not seeing what could be maximum pressure yet, right? One final point. Sanctions are more important than just North Korea. Article 41 sanctions are the barrier between peace and kinetic action. They exist to maintain international peace and security, to give the international community an opportunity to check dangerous behavior without having to adopt the use of force. So if you didn't have these sanctions, if you didn't have these tools, what are your alternatives for dealing with a situation like this, and not only North Korea? And finally, if North Korea is ever recognized as a nuclear state, and if sanctions proved ineffective, what's the lesson to other states that might be considering the nuclear option? What's the lesson to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Argentina? You know, it goes on. So the game is more than just the candle of North Korea, right? It really reaches out much more broadly, and it's much more important than that. And the NPT is at stake.
Okay. I know more questions in the queue, but you can hear more about the economic sanctions and economic challenges and economic policy of North Korea in the afternoon sessions. So this concludes the session 1. So thank you for participating actively in the discussion, and also thank you, panelists, for bringing your expertise to this gathering. So why don't you give a big hands to our panel?